Hi, good morning. I hope everyone had a wonderful evening last night. It was great to see everyone at the reception, and look forward to seeing folks throughout the course of the day. Thank you for making it here. I'm happy to see so many folks bright and early in the morning. We're really excited to be able to kick off today with a roundtable discussion on research integrity. We do have a few slides that we're going to show. We got special permission from Mark for that. So can we go to our slides? All right. Again, welcome. What we wanted to talk about today is so much that's happening in the research integrity space. It hardly seems that you can go to an event without it quickly becoming the hot topic of conversation. So this session is really put together to try to kind of tease apart how different stakeholders, how different players, different initiatives are kind of working together to approach this issue. Next slide, please. Oh, do we have to advance it up here? I'm sorry. A lot of moving pieces here. Oh, I thought we had like an overview. All right, so we're going to go ahead and kick off. As others have said, introductions for our speakers are in your program. We're going to briefly, each one of them is going to talk about their initiative. We're going to talk about how these initiatives fit together, and then we're going to move into roundtable questions pretty quickly. So take it away, Jen.
Good morning, everyone. Lovely to be here. I'm excited to get to talk about retractions. That's my day today, so it's wonderful to have this opportunity. I'm here to talk about communication of retractions, removals, and expressions of concern. So this is an initiative that NISO has been running over the past couple of years. And really, if you think about it, there's no point in doing a retraction if readers aren't aware of it. And that is a problem. It might surprise people to know that because obviously retractions have been in the news a fair bit recently, but it is. And retracted research continues to be cited and used inappropriately. And there's a lot of inconsistency around how retractions are kind of implemented. So CREC aims to provide a kind of set of standards for all stakeholders in implementing retractions to help overcome this problem. So the working group met for a couple of years, and it culminated in a report, a recommended practice by NISO in July last year. So before I move on to talk about some of the examples and recommendations that that group came out with, just a few kind of scope points to note. So first of all, this doesn't cover the editorial side of retractions. So the group wasn't looking at what should or shouldn't be a retraction, who should or shouldn't be making those decisions. It's very much, once that decision has happened, how do we make sure that retraction information gets out to the places it needs to get out to? The second point is that we're not talking about all post-publication changes here. We are just talking about retractions, expressions of concern, and removal. So not other changes like corrections or addenda or editorial notes, that kind of thing. A lot of the same principles would apply, but it is explicitly on retractions and expressions of concern. And finally, it's very much as is set of recommendations. The aim was to have as many stakeholders as possible able to engage in doing this best practice. So it's not aspirational, it's not technology that doesn't exist. It's very much what can we do right now with the stuff that we have right now and the stakeholders who are involved right now to improve how retractions are communicated. So to give you a flavor of the simplicity of some of these recommendations, one of the recommended practice is that all retractions have retracted at the beginning of the title of the retracted article. And that sounds really simple. It sounds like something that presumably people are doing already. But actually, one of the things that we surfaced in the group was that there's an enormous variety of practice. So some publishers put it at the end of the title. Some publishers use other words like withdrawn, or they use retraction instead of retracted. And this might sound a little bit pedantic, but then if you think about the impact that has, if indexes like Google, for example, that's the word retracted is what they look for when they want to decide whether to recrawl content and to therefore point to the new version of the file, which is watermarked as retracted. So essentially, it's a very simple recommendation, but it's something that has a potentially big impact. The bulk of the work, though, was really identifying and mapping the kind of stakeholders in the process and what their responsibilities are. It also looked at what information to give and receive in order for retractions to work effectively. So CREC is really a piece of the puzzle in terms of how we improve how readers, including machines, are made aware of retracted content. And importantly, the recommendations lay the foundation for other services and initiatives that rely on having good, clean, consistent metadata in order to help readers understand what's happened to the status of a piece of content. Thank you. I think it's this one next.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you all. Good morning. Good to see so many of you at the early hour. My name is Hielke Koers. I'm the Chief Information Officer for STM Solutions. And I'll be speaking about two initiatives. And then after Tom, I'll make an attempt to visualize how all of these different efforts can be seen as fitting together. But let me start by saying a few words about GetFTR, short for Get Full Text Research. It's an industry collaboration that was set up to streamline access to scholarly content. And the original use case that GetFTR focused on was really on making the journey from the point of discovery to the point of access as easy and as frictionless as possible. Originally, GetFTR was set up by ACS, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, Springer Nature and Elsevier, but we're now working with over 50 publishers and parties that integrate with us, like Discovery Services. Collectively, that covers close to 70% of article publications in both subscription-based journals, OA, hybrid, and also covering free content like editorials. So what GetFTR does specifically, to my mind, the value proposition splits into two parts. First, there is the entitlement signaling. So signaling to the researcher at the point of discovery if they have access to a particular piece of content, taking a lot of sort of the anxiety, click and pray out of the equation. The second bit that GetFTR does is provide GetFTR smart links that really optimize the journey from the point of discovery to access, and ideally that means one-click access to the PDF. To my mind, one of the things that makes GetFTR quite special is the point in the researcher or the reader workflow where it operates, namely at the point of discovery. That's quite exceptional, that you have an ability to signal something to the reader at that point in time. And how we use that capability and how we extended it, and that is the new bit that I'm talking about today, is to also present information about the retraction status or errata to researchers at the point of discovery. So really extending that notion of entitlement signaling to also alerting the researcher if a particular piece of content has been retracted or has been, or if there is any other material update that they should be aware about. You see that in the screenshot that is on the right of the slide. This is a screenshot of GetFTR operating on Google Scholar through the browser extension. There are several services that integrate natively with GetFTR, but we also have a browser extension. Sort of the bluish color, you see the entitlement signaling, so that is alerting the researcher that they will have access to that particular piece of content when they click on it. And so what's new is this alert to the fact that the work has been retracted. Of course, the link still works, that is available, and GetFTR can also present the reader, the researcher, with an overview, sort of a timeline between the moment of publication and the moment of retraction, with links to the original content and retraction notices, etc. So let me move on to the second initiative that I wanted to talk about, and that's CUSAP, which is short for Content Update Signaling and Alerting Protocol. This is a task and finish group that runs under STM's Standards and Technology Committee, or STEC. And it really comes from the observation that increasingly we see content, including the version of record, being offered at different platforms and different spaces to the researcher. In part, that is enabled by open access, which makes it easier, of course, to aggregate content in, for example, institutional repositories or domain-specific repositories. But we also see content syndication, and of course, aggregation has been in place for a longer period of time. So that's, of course, helpful to grow audience and to connect with other types of readers on those different platforms, which sometimes bring different audiences. But it also means that the challenge of safeguarding the integrity, and in particular the retraction status or other material updates to the work that impact the integrity, that suddenly becomes a lot more complex, because you don't have just a single copy to manage, but you have a multitude dispersed over different platforms and different places. So with the task and finish group, we started to explore the need for sort of a push-based notification service for retractions, corrections, expressions of concern. Basically taking the Crossref retraction watch database initially, but potentially extending that to other sources in the future. But the novelty is really make that into a push-based notification service that will proactively alert these types of content hosting platforms whenever an article has been retracted or some of these other updates. So the primary use cases or target services to integrate with such a service would be institutional or subject matter content repositories, content aggregators, syndicators like ScienceDirect and ResearchGate, abstracting indexing databases, references managers, quiz systems, but also LLMs, could imagine, could be a very, could consume this information and derive value or get some value out of that. We wanted to validate this assumption that this would be a good thing to have. So we did a pretty broad-ranging survey, which demonstrated, and that number really surprised me, it demonstrated that about 80% of these kind of services that we're talking about now currently do not have a mechanism in place to check for retractions, errata, corrigenda, or other updates to the scholarly content that they host. So I think that shows that there is a huge gap to be filled here. So with that, I think we validated the demand through both interviews as well as the survey. The task and finish group has developed metadata and technical specifications. That work is available. And we are now exploring, looking into options to develop those specifications into an initial MVP demonstrator. Still work to be done, so that is being explored, but that might be the next step. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tom.
Thanks, Hilke. So you might have noticed I'm not Chris Shillam, as it says on your program, so apologies for that, disappointing anyone there. I'm here to talk with the panel, but also about ORCID and how we think about scholarly. How we think about trust in the scholarly record. Trust markers are now kind of place within all of that. I can't see what I'm talking about in front of me, so I'll look over there. Right, so first of all, I'm going to kind of address some of the questions I've been having over the last couple of days with various delegates at the conference and really clarify that ORCID is a hub of open data that helps other people make decisions, right? We are a foundational piece of infrastructure that helps connect other systems and make those decisions that they need to make. It describes the provenance of all the items in the record, and this has been true since our inception in 2012. We've always been able to say who is saying what about whom. And we're not in the business, very importantly, of giving out giant green ticks. So we don't actually make value judgments about the contents of ORCID records, but we provide the infrastructure and the means for other people to make those decisions. I'll also point out that the way we see it, I suppose, is that identity is a community problem. ORCID is an international not-for-profit. We have 1,400 members. Between them, they contribute an awful lot of data that helps work out who can be trusted and who needs further work and investigation in certain use cases. And I'd like to point out also that those that are suffering from these issues around paper mills, publishing integrity, these kind of things, they're actually really well placed to help with a solution, which we believe is adding trust markers into the ORCID record and using them to make better decisions. Now, the ORCID model is that scholarly identities are cumulative. You build them up over time, and this is true in life. I think you build a reputation, people come to trust you, and it's the same with an ORCID record. And different use cases have quite different levels of trust. And I can illustrate this really with another question that I was chatting to someone yesterday about. Imagine you're recruiting someone and they send you a CV. Now it's got their name, it's got their education information on it, it's also got their employment information. And when you look at that, you've actually got enough trust usually at this point to say, okay, this looks like a good fit for my job. I mean, you invite them along to interview, you haven't verified any of this information yet. But for the use case of, well, I need to chat to this person, that's enough, right? So they come along and you talk to them and you think, well, this person's actually a really, really good fit. maybe I'll offer them a job. And at that point, you need a different level of trust, right? Some employers will go, that's fine, I believe everything you say. Others will do background checks, right? They'll do reference checks. So they need an extra elevated level of trust. They might contact previous employers. Say, did this person work here? But they might also say, did this person work here and were they any good, right? And again, depending on the role, you might also ask, well, did they actually earn this degree at that university which they're saying they did? And so on and so forth. You know, you can get background checks, all sorts of things in other jobs. But you need different levels of trust in different places in what someone is saying about themselves. And ORCID records are very simple. So when you do certain tasks, you can just take an ORCID record at face value. But when you're doing other things, let's say submitting a manuscript, then the trust markers in the ORCID record can help you decide whether or not you need to do further checks before believing this is a bona fide researcher, right? And one of the things that's kind of little known, I suppose, about this is that we now have 50% of the active records in the ORCID registry do have at least one trust marker. So that's 4.5 million people have a piece of information on their ORCID record that has been added by an organization rather than the user and is flagged as such. And this can be a list of previous publications. This could be funding from a funder or the fact that they're employed by a particular university or they earned a degree there. So all of this information accumulates over their career to the point where you can look at an ORCID record and you can be fairly certain it's a bona fide researcher with a good track record, which is actually what you need if you're going to make a decision about to push them through the publishing process without investigating them further. At least that's what we believe. And to make all this happen, as you are familiar with ORCID, you do need the identity owners involved. There's no real other way to scale this. So we have 9 million, well, over 9 million active users. It's very difficult to scale any kind of trust and identity system without the user involved. And they go around the internet, granting permission, and hopefully, and what we see is all of these different actors, the people in this room, publishers, the universities, the libraries, contributing information back to ORCID so that everyone can benefit from this big bundle of trust that ORCID is custodian of. So yeah, I'm going to hand it back to Silke.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. So before we enter the panel discussion, we thought it might be helpful to show you our attempt of visualizing how all of these things fit together, which is a bit of a tall order, and I'm sure we will discuss that in more detail in the panel discussion, and you might have audience questions about that. But here we go. This is a visualization of not the researcher to reader, but the reader to researcher, perhaps, flow. Of course, it's a simplification, like any diagram of these sorts, but just to talk you through, starting at the left, the journey here starts when the researcher discovers a piece of content. They then decide to read that. Then the magic happens. It enters the actual research machinery. They analyze it, they work it, they compare it with other methods, they formulate hypotheses, and then a new research output is produced, which is submitted as an article. It gets published, but unfortunately, it also gets retracted. So how do the various initiatives that we spoke about, that you heard about, how do they map into such a diagram? Starting with CREC. I think CREC, the value here that CREC delivers is in better harmonizing, streamlining, organizing the metadata around retractions, and giving the ability to better store that in a retraction database. Then be picked up by downstream services. So GetFTR can use that information from a retraction database to signal retractions, expressions of concern, etc. at the point of discovery. CUSAP also takes that information, but then in a slightly different point in the workflow, so a different integration target. It would take the same information, but then use it to alert the reader when they are about to read the article on a platform, like an institutional repository, abstracting and indexing database, etc. So really at the point of reading or interacting with the material. ORCID is a bit of a different lens on this, because ORCID does not deal with content, but ORCID deals with people. But of course, all of the content items that you see in this flow are usually associated with people. So ORCID presents perhaps a different lens on the view, connecting with the people behind the work that gets submitted, published, retracted in this case, but also the people whose work is being discovered and being read. So with that, let me hand over to Heather to start
Great.
the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully you found the visualization to be helpful. I certainly did as well. I realized I forgot to introduce myself from Heather Staines from Delta Think. Usually I write at the beginning of my notes really big, introduce yourself. I didn't do that today. So I want to kick things off. Why so many initiatives? I mean, it's a bit of a rhetorical question. We know that there are integrity issues, but we are in a space where there are a lot of initiatives coming up at the same time. And is that an issue? Are they competing? Is there going to be one ring, to rule them all? Do they need to join forces? Would it be problematic if they joined forces? I'm actually going to start with Hilke on that one, and then the other panelists can weigh in as well.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to kick it off. And I know you both have some things to say about it as well, so I'll be brief. But from where I'm standing, I think what we see with these different initiatives popping up is really a reflection or a manifestation how innovation starts in different places. Each of these initiatives have sort of their own origin story, their own organizational structure, their own stakeholder group, and sort of collectively we're learning, developing. It's very much an organic rather than a designed process in many ways, I would think. I don't think that's necessarily a problem as long as we make sure we keep interacting with each other, we keep talking with each other, we keep presenting what we do, and don't miss out on opportunities to create integrations or ways to collaborate.
Tom?
Yeah, I don't see it as a disadvantage at all. I see it more as an advantage, I think. You can just see from the diagram, the three systems we're talking about here are all placed very differently already. But I think the main thing here is there are many different stakeholders, right, and many different use cases. Readers need different tooling to editors. If you're doing bibliometrics, you need different tooling from other people again. These are all different user experiences that require different nuances, different views of the same kind of information. And it doesn't make sense to bundle them all together. I mean, Hilke made the point just a second ago that ORCID, in fact, we've got little dashed lines on this diagram because we don't directly do this, right? We support this, and there are many other things that could be in this diagram that are foundational things that other people build tools on top of. And yeah, you need a diverse set of tooling because we have a diverse community, and within that community, you can split it down again into lots and lots of different roles of people with various perspectives and interests, and they need their needs met. And the way you can do that is to have different initiatives to tackle them.
Mm-hmm. Jen, did you want to add anything?
I mean, I think Hilke and Tom have covered it mostly, but I mean, working in RI, there's just a huge explosion of experimentation in RI at the moment, which is great. It's really wonderful to see how far we've kind of come in the past maybe 3 to 5 years. So overall, I think it's great. And as you pointed out, Tom, like different stakeholders, different users have different needs. Where I would kind of qualify that slightly is that I guess at some point, particularly from the reader perspective, there might have to be some sort of bringing together synthesis phase, because there's a risk that the point of a retraction could become undermined if it kind of depends who you ask. So if you have different tools drawing on slightly different data sets, slicing it in slightly different ways, then I think the authority of a retraction could be undermined. But I think we're not there yet. I think just now it's mostly very complementary, and it's really great to see kind of all the experimentation that's going on.
Mm-hmm. So while we've spoken about several initiatives, we certainly couldn't cover all of them on this stage, or we need more chairs. So maybe we can talk about some of the other initiatives who are not here, because we'd like to bring those into the conversation. Tom, you said you could talk to us a little bit about the publication facts label.
Yeah, I can talk about PFAT. John talked about it yesterday in the first session, and I think publication facts label was definitely one approach that could well work here. It's a great way of rooting trust in the reader context, where you can trust in a journal and the outputs in that journal based on who has reviewed them and who is editing that journal. Because then readers have a way of mapping back their concept of should I trust this object to human beings who they may trust from other contexts, right? So if the editor is a renowned practitioner in their own discipline and you can see their track record, then you have an elevated level of trust in the things that are going through their editor's desk, right? these kind of things. And they can do these sort of things already, but I think the PFL was a really nice and, to your point, consistent way of doing it. And we see from other things like seamless access, for example, which was, Hilke, I think you might have been involved in a little bit. But what they did was, and I know it's a different topic, but what they did is they unified a user experience. So the user experience before seamless access was every publisher would do everything in a different way. It was actually very difficult for users to use, right? And seamless access put the user at the center of that. And then people started clicking the button more because they'd seen it before and they understood what it was. And the PFL is similar in that it creates a user experience that readers will understand because it's consistent across platforms. And they can relate it to something in the real world, right? Now, I'm not sure what nutrition facts labels look like outside of Europe and North America, so this is an issue. We support 20 different languages in ORCID, for example, and they're all very well used. So these kind of things have to be think because we're in an international context, but I do believe it's a good way of describing trust to readers in things they're reading.
And another initiative that comes up a lot when we talk about trust is Crossmark. Hilke, can you talk a little bit about whether these initiatives are trying to be the end of Crossmark, work with Crossmark, what's happening kind of in that space?
Yeah, no, we should probably have added that to this diagram, but this is by no means an attempt to be comprehensive. There's much more happening. This is just what we happen to be speaking about today. Crossmark also really operates at the point where a researcher would actually start reading or interacting with scholarly work. It taps into the same data, is my understanding. What I think a challenge that we have with Crossmark is sort of the usage of it has two steps of adoption. First of all, publishers need to adopt it and be able to inject it into the PDFs and the online rendition of the article. But then also the cross-ref model is that the user, the reader themselves need to click on the icon in order to be informed if the article is still current or something, there is a material update or a retraction perhaps. So that puts that information one click away, and one click away may not sound like a very long distance, but we know in practice that does mean it's often pretty much hidden from the actual user in their experience as they interact with the material. So an initiative like CUSAP aims to get rid of that one click away and not put the onus on the researcher to actively seek if there is an update or a change about the status of the work they should know about, but to bring that to them proactively.
So with the publication facts label and with Crossmark, and certainly to a degree with GetFTR, because there is an indicator, that requires a little bit of thinking on the part of the publisher or the platform host about how the page is presented to the user, the old real estate problem we're always talking about. Yesterday, up here on stage, Toby Green said, why do universities not put their brand on the research that they produce? And I just had a vision of an article that kind of looked like a race car in the States with all the different like stickers on it that came to it. How do we feel about what are the responses to having additional brands, visible on platforms and on content?
Well, we've got plenty of experience for this. We benefit, I think. So ORCID logos appear in a lot of places now. They appear in lists of authors, but they also appear in terms of the sign-in mechanism. So sign in with ORCID, there's quite often an ORCID logo on that, according to our best practices, these kind of things. And we really benefited by being a community initiative from the start. ORCID was conceived and formed by a group of publishers, universities, and funders who all got together and said, this is a good idea. What this meant is we had several large publishers on board at the start, which meant they were at least somewhat committed to rolling this out. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that. Publishers may own journals, but they don't necessarily have as much influence over some editors as I was expecting, because I'm like John Walensky, an amateur. In fact, I actually am an amateur. So I've been discovering these things as we go along. But we had a lot of goodwill because publishers, especially, were looking at the other systems being developed by other publishers and thinking, well, I don't want to embed this identity system that's owned by another corporation, right, for-profit company. So they could agree between them that the best thing to do is to trust this to a community-run not-for-profit, ORCID. So they did implement it and they put it on their pages. And I don't know what that means for this really, other than you need the major publishers on board to all agree on a similar approach to take that forward, I think.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys want to add anything to that? Or?
I think it makes a lot of sense conceptually to have sort of these different sources of authority of trust. I think maybe an analogy, you mentioned seamless access, right? In access mechanism, there is this notion of sort of trust hierarchies with sort of nested list of points of authority that ultimately mean, you know, a certain entity or a certain piece of content reaches a higher trust level. I think it also makes a lot of sense to think about research integrity in that way, that you can have many sources of authority that bestow some form of trust on a particular piece of content. Ultimately then up to the journals, the publishers, the individual researchers to decide how much trust is enough, right? That will vary on context, that will vary on the specific situation and the action that somebody is taking. So conceptually that makes a lot of sense. I do see the usability challenge in what I think they call the NASCAR effect, right? I don't know, most publishers are, I think, you know, for good reasons, protective of not over cluttering the article page that's already, you know, there's a lot of information all there already. So it's I think it's really a usability design challenge to think through how to bring that together in a way that does justice to the different sources of authority, while at the same time presenting the researcher, the reader, with the type of trust markers, information they need at the right moment in their workflow.
Yeah, and you guys mentioned, you know, the researchers being able to kind of recognize the signal, and I think sometimes that can be a piece of the puzzle that gets a little bit lost. Tom, when you were mentioning, you know, what do nutrition labels look like around the world, I thought about, I used to live in Japan and I didn't understand this code. If you are offering a drink in a container in Japan and it's 100% fruit juice, it can have a picture of the whole fruit on it. If it's not 100%, it will show a slice of the fruit. And if it's basically not at all the fruit, it's just fruit flavored, it has the cartoon drawing of the fruit. I lived there a couple of times, did not understand it, and I wonder if the people who are buying the drinks in Japan understand. So you can have a very smart system like that, but if people don't know how to read it, you know, then you're kind of losing something in the translation. I want to move to Jen, you know, with this next question and take a slightly different perspective, and then after that we're going to open that up to your questions. Let's talk about stakeholders that are not here with us on the stage. This could be researchers and tools, this could be universities with repositories, funders, and even organizations like COPE. You know, can we bring them into this conversation a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning, so I should say that I'm also a COPE Council member, so I'll put my COPE hat on for a minute. I think, again, a lot of it's complementary. So as I said about the CREC initiative, CREC doesn't focus on the decision-making around retraction. That's very much sort of COPE territory, like the editorial process, the decisions around that lead to retractions or post-publication actions. In terms of researchers, I think about this a lot, and I love that analogy of the Japanese fruit cartons. So when I was a researcher myself during my PhD and my postdoc, honestly, I can't remember even knowing what an expression of concern was. Like, you know, I think that's the level, at least maybe 10, 12 years ago, that it was at. And I don't know if my experience is representative, but I do think there's something really important about engaging researchers in this. Has that changed now? Because there's a lot more attention on retractions. You know, I don't know. Is it a default part of a researcher workflow to go and have a look at, oh, I'll just go back to my bibliography and check if anything's been retracted? I don't know if that's the standard step. So I definitely think that researchers are a little bit neglected in this, and we're making tools ostensibly for them. So I think that their viewpoint here would be really essential to taking this forward.
Mm-hmm. If we have any questions from the audience, I see we've got a hand up in the back. I don't know who is running the microphone. I say, is that Andrew? I can like really put my eyes by.
Hi there.
Hello.
That was loud.
That's Andrew.
Andrew, PSI. Just looking at the chart, a couple of thoughts. ORCID's got a dotted. ORCID has a dotted line from the retractions up to discover, and Hilke was talking about, you know, retracted papers being linked to GetFTR. Is ORCID going to put on their profiles whether that person has had papers retracted for nefarious reasons? Is that a good place to put it? And then could GetFTR then pick that up? So even if it's not a retracted paper, because as we know, if there's 6 authors in a retracted paper, it's likely that one or more of them has probably got other papers that haven't been retracted yet, because we just haven't had the time to go through all the previous papers, and put like a warning, so not a trust marker, but a kind of and not antitrust, but you know what I mean, be careful before you trust this marker on other papers.
I guess I should take that one. The blunt answer is no, we are not going to do that. And there are many reasons why we wouldn't do that. ORCID is a researcher-centric system. I completely agree. Researchers are not in this room. Well, some of us are researchers, I guess. And then certainly not on this panel as representing researchers. We're representing bits of infrastructure and organisations and things like that. But ORCID's research controlled. They control everything that's on their record. This is one of our founding principles. And really, the only way we've managed to develop our system from 0 users to 9.5 million active users is by maintaining the trust of researchers. And if you go back to the analogy I was using about CVs, you wouldn't write in your CV, oh, I worked here, I worked there, and I worked here, but I was terrible at my job, and they sacked me, and all sorts of other bad things about yourself. You don't put bad things on your own CV, right? And researchers will not be prepared to put up with a system that is making value judgments. Again, we don't make value judgments about the quality of an ORCID record. That's for other people to do. Now, that said, we are a piece of foundational infrastructure other people can build tools upon, and that's where ORCID sits in this infrastructure. So these dotted lines are people using the ORCID metadata to essentially associate the fact that this retraction is associated with this person, but it's stored elsewhere, displayed elsewhere, where it's more useful, I would argue. So we are supporting this, but what we're not doing is displaying it on our pages because it doesn't make sense. We only really support positive trust markers. I work here, I've written this. All of that being said again, the trust marks on ORCID record, as I mentioned, they're always, the green ticks that you see, they're always added by an ORCID member. So this could be a publisher. So for example, I don't know, Springer, add a publication, this person's written it, and this publication gets retracted. What can the publisher do? Well, they can do a couple of things. They can edit that thing that they've added, right? So they can go along with whatever guidance comes out of NISO. They can put the word retracted in that title on that paper that's added by them in the ORCID record because they control that piece of metadata and they've added it with the researcher's permission. They can also delete it and say, I no longer want to put that trust marker onto that person's ORCID record. Mm-hmm. But the researcher can always delete it, right? So if the member updates the title, the researcher can control it, the visibility and the contents of the ORCID record can always remove it. Right? But all of those things are possible, so those responsible for making statements about people and the things they've done can always edit them within an ORCID record. That's completely fine. But ultimately, the researcher has control. So this is why I believe we've got the dotted lines here, is these ORCIDs are in the DOI metadata, and we were talking about who else is not on the stage, and I think Crossref, for example, they're not on the stage. And they're the custodians of research, output-centric metadata, so journal articles generally, but books and all these things. They're concerned with putting the outputs at the center of what they do. And at that point, the output does contain the ORCID IDs, which is great. So when the output gets retracted in Crossref, marked as retracted, the ORCID IDs are attached to it already, and they're not going to go anywhere. So the ORCID ID is embedded in the system. We're not displaying on our page for the reasons I've given.
Mm-hmm. And Hilke?
So you asked a question, Andrew, if GetFTR would use that type of information, and also there I think the answer is, at least at this point in time, no, because for GetFTR the signaling is very much tied to that individual content item. So it's really specific to that DOI, and that's sort of the vicinity in the network, like authors, co-authors, or other work that is somehow related and might be retracted. It's really very specific about that particular piece of content. An application area where that's different are technologies, tools that scan submitted manuscripts for potential indications of research integrity concerns. The STM Integrity Hub is a program that I work on, but other tools do this as well, where, for example, you look through the reference list of submitted manuscripts to see if there is an odd amount of retracted papers. There can be good reasons for that, right? But at least it's an indicator that further analysis, further scrutiny might be warranted. Because we know, for example, that paper mills tend to cite other paper mill material that gets retracted more than the average work. So then you really start to do heuristics on the basis of the network of how that piece of content fits with other content and with other authors. So that's an example where I do think you look at that sort of broader network view to figure out signals that could be indicative of a concern.
And I want to just bring you in on this, Jen, because one of the things we talked about in our planning call is there could be many reasons why something is retracted. And that was obviously a topic of discussion for CREC, but what was the outcome?
Yeah, so this age-old chestnut. We did talk about this a lot. Should there be a kind of taxonomy of retractions? Should there be some kind of formalized structure for reporting what a retraction was for? In the end, we decided that CREC wasn't going to go there at that point in time. There's also a sort of fundamental tension here in that the most frequently requested taxonomy is some distinction between honest error and misconduct or fraud. But I've always been, and generally most of the time still am, in the camp of saying that's not a publisher's job. So a retraction, the purpose of a retraction isn't to sort of point fingers. It's not to sort of say that you did something wrong and these people did something right. It's to correct the scholarly record. So the simple reason for this is just that publishers are very rarely in the position of having enough information to make that call. It would take a long time to get that information, and we already know retractions are too slow. So I don't think it's a good use of editor time to try and sort of ascribe guilt or, whose fault something was. The point is to let readers know what's wrong with that content. That's not to say there shouldn't be something else that does that, like it's possible, but publishers and editors aren't researchers, employers. They often don't have insight into the process leading to that, to misconduct, for example. So there's that side of it. The only time I kind of jump off the fence onto the other side is when it is something that publishers have full visibility of. So this could be something like something wrong with the peer review process or accidental publication of the wrong file. Like there, it can be quite clear to figure out what, if something has gone wrong, it was under our aegis that happened, and maybe there's scope there for there to be something different. The final thing I'd say that might help here is retraction notices themselves. Currently, they're just free text. So currently, they're not sort of in a good machine readable form. They're not structured. It's quite hard to extract information from them in a consistent way. And I think there's a lot of scope there for pulling out things that could get at this. So was there an institutional investigation? Yes, no. Did all authors agree with this? Yes, no. I wrote a preprint a few years ago with a colleague, Dr. Hissini, about this and sort of proposed a sort of taxonomy for the notice itself. So not splitting retractions, but within the retraction. And I think that gets at some of this, what's a retraction for? Is it a guilty retraction or not? But without having to cast that stone. So it's very fact-based.
Great. Who's got the microphone? I saw Kave's hand first and then Richard.
Do about the same time. On Jenny's point about, I can see what you mean. You don't want to get involved in whether there was a problem or not, or it's debatable. But one thing publishers could do, and I'm wondering what you think about this, is to point without comment to any external links. For example, PubPeer, or normally it's PubPeer. So we've got, for example, one of the things we do, just free of charge, we do animations on PubPeer. We've got 3,700 animations on PubPeer supporting people like Elizabeth Bick, etc. So that would be good to have those links. So at least there's not for myself, but for all the sleuths who are working free of charge, to point it in that direction.
And you want to?
Yeah, just 100% agree. Like, I think it's not our formal guidance at Cambridge University Press at the moment, but if a PubPeer comment is relevant to why we retracted something, we would include that as a, information point.
Yeah. Richard?
Thanks. I'm Richard Northover. I am working with STM on researcher identity, as it happens. My question was about the trust markers and the idea of, I suppose, the idea of adding logos and things like that. If I'm an institution and I add a trust marker to something that says, this is a researcher that works definitely for me, then I, as that institution, I'm vouching for that person. I'm saying, because the world trusts me as an institution, you can trust this person. But the flip side of trust is one of the flip sides of trust is accountability. So if somebody goes on to act fraudulently, and that leads to a retraction, what does that mean for me as the institution that said, trust me, you can trust this person? What do you think about the sort of accountability flip side of these loops? How do you make sure that trust continues to mean something? If that makes sense.
I have a feeling I should be speaking to this, and this is the kind of question, Richard, that usually I would ask you to share your thoughts on, but now you are asking the question. You do raise a very good point about that accountability aspect, right? And maybe to give a little bit of context for people in the audience, Richard and I and others are working in a task and finish group at STM thinking about the role that researcher identity can play to protect, uphold research integrity. And there's ways to make it more difficult for bad actors to take part in the editorial system. Of course, let's be very careful to not exclude bona fide researchers or not make it harder than it needs to be. But there's also that accountability aspect. And I think that also relates to the trust hierarchies that I alluded to, right? There's sort of one level in between the trust that a researcher would get via the institution. I think in terms of how to weigh that and how to have that almost sort of the burden of that accountability, right? I think it's important to recognize that, you know, there will always be instances where something go wrong. A perfectly legitimate institute can hire a researcher who goes on to behave in a way that's not within the norms and ethics of what they are supposed to be doing. I hope we get to a culture where that sort of where that's recognized, and people feel that it is the good thing. It's the good thing to do, to act on that, to be accountable for that, to investigate what has gone wrong. And then over time, if you would see that there are specific institutions who much more than average have these problems, that they do some self-inspection, take a look, you know, do they have the right processes in place to avoid that from happening, maybe learn from one another. So I would hope that over time, with having that information available in a transparent way, accountability can really drive improvement processes at all of these different levels, not only the individual, but also the institutes and the funders and publishers, etc.
Yeah, we work on a lot of research integrity projects at Delta, I think, and one of the challenges, I think, is that what we talk about on the publishing side is research integrity, and what the universities talk about at research integrity are completely different levels. I mean, they're worried about scandals and being, defunded, and the legislature, kind of coming down on them. And, we're talking about individual papers typically, and it has to rise up to where it's an overwhelming, almost embarrassing amount of fraud or misconduct connected to one researcher before there's even a chance, that research getting moved. So I feel like we're talking at different levels. Tom, and then we have probably one more question about that.
Yeah. I suppose I've been having a few conversations about this, and it seems to me that nobody wants to be accountable. So the publishers don't want to be accountable because they don't want their reputation lost. The institutions don't want to be accountable because it's a huge amount of work to go through these investigations, and also reputation loss. The researchers definitely don't want to be accountable. They wouldn't be trying to scam their way through a publication process otherwise, right? But nobody seems to want to be accountable. And chatting to some editors, they're saying, even if I know who the person is and I know they're definitely doing something wrong, if I get in touch with the editor, nothing happens. So I go to the institution and nothing happens, right? So nobody in this equation wants to be accountable. And talking about the logo on the paper, right, is if you put your logo up there, are you putting your stamp of trust on the paper rather than the people, the paper, right? And I imagine you don't want to, right? Because then you're accountable for the contents of that paper. by sticking your logo at the top. And at the moment, it's buried and probably shared between lots of different authors, lots of different places. But if you stick your logo top and center on a paper, you're accountable for the contents of that paper, at least in a lot of people's eyes. So yeah, I think there needs to be more accountability. There needs to be consequences. So if you are, but nobody wants to do it. Even publishers saying, okay, so we've retracted this, but we're not going to say they did it on purpose or anything like this. We're just going to say, here's a bunch of facts, and you can make up your own mind. And this is where we end up, I think.
Yeah, Helga?
Well, I am a perennial optimist, but I do think I am seeing indications. So it's a painful process, right?
Yeah.
That's clear. But at least in conversations I have with publishers, there does seem to be also that sort of cultural shift, perhaps, or awareness that it is important to be doing the right thing. It is painful to do retractions. It's painful to do mass retractions, but there is a certain pride in doing the right thing as well that I see.
Oh, definitely. I think the human beings involved, everyone in this room, completely sees this. But as a business that's involved in making huge amounts of money, be it a university or a publisher, you're not incentivized to do retractions. That you get measured on your good behavior. You know, as a university, you go up ranking lists. You don't go down based on your retractions, at least as far as I'm aware. Please correct me if I'm completely wrong on that. So you're not incentivized to retract anything, really, because it just makes you look bad. Authors don't retract their own papers. They don't sanction themselves. Institutions don't want to retract things, and neither do publishers, I think.
As our publisher on the stage,
not the people in this room.
Dying to get in here.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's the individuals involved, but as a business that's trying to make money, you're not incentivized to make yourself look bad.
Yeah.
So I was just going to make 2 points. One is I was really pleased to hear Professor Walensky raise the allusion to regulation the other day. Like, I do think that this is something that it's time as an industry we consider and think about what that could look like. The second point I wanted to make about accountability, Richard, to your question, accountability relies on the entities existing. I think we're at the stage at the moment where sometimes the affiliations are fake. I have looked at articles and I've gone to Google Street View and I've seen a car park. It's not an affiliation. There are identities of individuals who are just email addresses. So I think accountability relies on knowing that there's an fake accountability. So we're not even at the stage of reporting on if people are doing enough accountability. It just is none. So I think that's something that's worth bringing in here. And just to respond to Tom, your point, I think that's changing a lot. I think publishers, it's increasingly more embarrassing if you don't retract than if you do.
Brilliant.
So I think that's
great.
Yeah, that's a good change. I want to get, in the back, is it Daniel who has his hand up for just a little bit? Quick question, because we're going to wrap up, and then Hilke, you can come in with your remarks.
Yeah, hi, sorry, Dan Shanahan from PLOS. It will be a quick question because actually that conversation covered a lot of what I wanted to unpack. But I think my question here is, you end with that optimistic note that sort of not retracting is becoming, you know, frowned upon. But actually, particularly with these tools, we're now seeing the AI tools to do trust markers in journals. One of the major ones is number of retractions. And I think it is disincentivizing. I think we've gone full circle. We went through a stage of it became, you know, not bad, and now it's becoming, because of blind tools, it looks bad again. And I think, you know, I'm not saying anyone in this room, the major publishers still will because it's an integrity piece, but you are seeing journals not retract, like just kind of going, oh yeah, we're just going to move on. And it's exactly the same at institutions. We've had, probably same as you, we've flagged behavior and the institution's been reluctant to engage in case it looks bad. And you can't tell them they're wrong because it does look bad. People do then go, ooh, pointing fingers. You know, someone mentioned the Hindawi thing yesterday, 12,000 retractions. You could argue that was good. Not that they had to, but that they did. So how do we flip that conversation on its head and go, look, post-publication curation from both an institution and a journal is fundamentally important. Stop punishing people who do it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So in response to that kind of last words, so we can wrap up, Hilke?
I think it is the question to ask. I don't have the full answer, but a couple of thoughts. I think we're also in a phase of recalibration. Exactly how do you weigh the data point of something being retracted? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I do think at the end of the day, reputation is so critical in both research academia itself as well as scholarly communication that's going to drive where we see that calibration. I think ignoring research integrity concerns will eventually damage reputation, and it's not good for any entity in this constellation in the long run.
Tom?
Yeah, so along with reputation, I think incentives are the main thing. We talk a lot about technological solutions to problems, but they're around reputation and incentives for different behaviours. We can put as much technological effort into solving problems, but if incentives remain, people just work their way around. And the problem just shifts somewhere else, I think. So, yeah, it's tackling incentives for good behaviour as well as bad behaviour to solve this problem fully, I think.
Yeah, Jen?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just echo exactly what my panelists said, but I do think the act of retraction is sort of due a bit of an overhaul in some ways. Firstly, you know, with the increase in sort of open science philosophy, we're in a world now where showing your working is much more normal. We're not in a stage where the publication is your, you know, I stand by this till I die. It's like, yeah, I tried this and I tried that, and then maybe I tried that too. And maybe the way retractions are conceived just now is meant to apply to like the whole study. It's meant to apply to like the conclusion that you reach. It's not meant to apply to like the steps that you took to get there, or the bits of that study. So I think there's lots of scope for thinking about retractions in a different way, whether that's versioning, whether there's sort of it's more like coding and, you know, you have forks in research. But I think retractions are possibly creaking a bit, for the reasons we've discussed today and other ones.
Yeah, and we had so much more, you know, that we could discuss. And my apologies if we didn't get to your question. You know, certainly find one of our speakers in the break. We talked in planning to put this committee together, this panel together, about what the implications were going to be for LLMs and retractions, trying to get that information out. And also, Jen raised an important point where, you know, as research and science moves along, there's an expectation that everything would be maybe out of date or superseded or proven not to be true in the long run. And should we start from a premise where, you know, things have like a certain shelf life and, you know, they're kind of working towards end of life. So really, really fruitful discussions. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation today and learned something. If you're interested in learning more about any of these initiatives, some of them you can probably still get involved with, and others are going to be moving along shortly, so stay tuned. Let's thank our speakers one more time, and then we will take a break.